Oh, it's a wonderful passage, and there's so much we could unpack. And there's about 25 sermons in that passage. But we're going to focus on the little word consolation. And so you'll see that the sermon title is Consolation is a Person. Consolation is a person. And I hope that by the time we finish unpacking this, that will have significance and meaning to you, that you will take with you through those doors and into your week, into our community, and into your lives. Consolation is a person. Every human being on earth is fighting an unseen battle. Everybody that you see is carrying an invisible burden. And it's possible to get so caught up and obsessed with my own story that I never think about what's going on in other people's story. That was an opening introduction by John Ortberg, who wrote the book, If You Want to Walk on Water, You've Got to Get Out of the Boat. He was a big pastor in Menlo Park. He started at Willow Creek. He was one of the main pastors there, and then started a big church out in San Mateo, and grew to about a $25 million annual budget. And then through some family issues, they actually asked John to leave. And instead of Bill Hybels and some of these other megachurch pastors who just ran away and hid, he humbled himself, opened his heart, made himself vulnerable to the world, and he has a podcast called Becoming New, and you can listen to it for free. And this was the opening on one of his podcasts by a man who knows much pain. And in the world of Christian success, seems to have fallen from grace into the pool of humility and ministers life and mercy and compassion and forgiveness. So let me just read that opening line again. Every human being on earth is fighting an unseen battle. Everybody that you see is carrying an invisible burden. Each one of you here this morning, I know, is. We know some of what's going on inside, and we share some of what's going on inside, but we all have those places inside of us that are an unseen burden, an unseen battle that each and every one of us is carrying. It's possible to get so caught up and obsessed with my own story that I never think about what's going on in other people's story. So, story. I know you guys love stories. You all say, oh, Pastor, that was a great sermon, and I really love that story. And so we're going to start with a story, and we're going to end with a story. This is a true story. Comes from the author Brennan Manning, who wrote Ragamuffin Gospel and Abba's Father, Abba's Child. So he tells a story of riding on a bus, and the bus stops in front of a hospital at the bus stop, and a man with about 4 or 5 kids jumps on the bus, and he sits down and just seems to be looking at the floor. In the meantime, his kids are raising havoc all over the bus. They're running around and they're bumping into people, and people are looking at this man like, what kind of a father are you? Why don't you do something about these kids? But nobody said anything until finally one of the kids bumped into a person and spilt their hot coffee on their lap, and the person, hey, for crying out loud, what are you going look at? Can't you see what your kids are doing? And the man said, oh, I'm so sorry. We just came from the hospital where their mother just passed. They don't know what to do. And I don't either. All of a sudden, the perception of that man completely changed. And there was compassion and empathy. Each one of us has a story. Our lives are a story. And each of us are carrying certain burdens that nobody else knows about. Simeon holds a little 8-day-old vulnerable baby, and what does he say? My eyes have seen the consolation of Israel. So that word, consolation, what does that word mean? Well, it's made up of two Latin words. The prefix con. Does anybody know what the prefix con means? With. And the root of the word is solus. With solus. My eyes have seen the consolation of Israel. What does it mean, solus? Solus means to comfort and meet us in our grief, to assuage, to soothe. And the Latin comes from the Greek, which is in our New Testament text, paraklesis. And Peg and others, pastor, will know, paraklesis is the Greek word, a paraclete, the Holy Spirit. I will send you the paraclete, Jesus promises. It's better for you that I go away that he may come, he actually says. And what is that paraklesis? What does that mean? It means one to take a stand with you, one who comes to take your side. We're all carrying certain burdens that we sometimes feel so alone with. But Simeon is telling us now I can actually go to the grave in peace because my eyes have seen the consolation that I've been waiting for all my life. Now, let's not forget the context that this consolation shows up in. You know, we think that things are tough politically, socially, economically, globally. Ukraine and Russia, Hamas and Israel, civil war all over Africa, families divided by politics in our own nation, our futures of economics uncertain, and we don't know what's going on. Let me tell you, when this baby shows up, these people were so severely oppressed, they were paying at least 70% taxes to Rome. It was horrific. And religion was stuck and stagnant and stale. The Pharisees fighting with the Sadducees, and the Pharisees and Sadducees fighting with the Sanhedrin, and just a mess of things. And there was no seeming consolation when this 8-day baby is found in the temple in the arms of this priest Simeon, who had been waiting all his life. And he looks at a baby and says, now I can die in peace, for my eyes have seen the consolation of Israel. Are you hungry this morning for consolation? Story number 2. Whenever we go through our Christmas passages, often and rightly so, and Mary is often so exonerated and focused on, and should be. Absolutely. But I want to tell you a story of a different person. It's a story of a young man who was growing up in a poor town, in a poor neighborhood, and was of poor means. But this man had such integrity. He was so respected in his society, both by his family, by people who knew him, and both by his religious community. He was a man of devotion and integrity. And like every other young man his age, he longed to have a family and to get married. So he found a young girl, 14 years old, and they were betrothed. They got engaged. And things seemed to be going wonderfully. She also was from a poor neighborhood, a person of little means. They understood each other. They got along together. They could make this journey together. And then one day she comes home and she says, honey, I have something to tell you. What, he says? Well, I'm pregnant. Pregnant? We've never slept together. We're engaged. Are you kidding me? I'm ready to lay down everything and to start this journey of life, giving my heart only to you. What do you mean that you're pregnant? So she gives this story. 14-year-old girl gives this story. It's not what you think, honey. I've been impregnated by God. Could you imagine poor Joseph going home to his parents to explain Mary's pregnancy? No, Mom, Dad, it's not what you think. She's been impregnated by God. Joseph, are you crazy? What's the matter with you? You bring shame on our family. Think of Mary trying to explain it to her parents. But Joseph, being the man of character and integrity and humility that he was, purposed in his heart just, under the law of Moses, do you know what he could have had done to Mary? Do you know what they could do to people who committed adultery? Stone them to death. How dare you bring shame on our family? Impregnated by God. Are you also crazy? So Joseph falls asleep. His world is blown apart. He's completely disoriented. And he has a dream. You know the dream. And God says, Joseph, don't put her away. She's telling the truth. She's going to bear a child who is from me. So Joseph wakes up and he decides, you know what? Okay. Get this. I am going to take Mary's side. This is something he will live with for the rest of his life. Jesus will be called illegitimate. And Mary will be seen as a person of shame and scorn. And here's Joseph, lowly Joseph, the husband. But what does he do? He takes her side. Joseph becomes to Mary the consolation of God. Now, in a minute, we're going to celebrate and participate in communion. But I want to make this point. Long before Jesus ever hung on that cross and became the consolation of the world, hanging there looking at the very ones who put the nails in his hand and saying, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." From that very cross, what did he do? He took the side of his own enemies who had tortured him and nailed him there. He became the consolation of sinners like me, of people who don't always get it right, who make mistakes and hurt others. He has become my consolation. But before Jesus ever became the consolation on the cross, Joseph became the consolation and protection of Mary, taking her side. Joseph, before ever Jesus was our consolation, was the consolation of Jesus Christ. You see, consolation we keep thinking is going to happen when this political climate changes, or this financial situation changes, or when my reputation changes, or when I get this and I'll be finally satisfied. Then I will have peace and consolation, because then things will be right. But that's not the consolation that Simeon held in his arms. He held a baby Jesus in his arms and said, "Now I can die in peace because I have seen the consolation of Israel." This is a shocking story of God. That the almighty, perfect, pure God would see us in our condition and choose in grace to take our side? People, come on. It's not fair. God is so much better than fair. Every human being on earth is fighting an unseen battle. Everybody that you see is carrying an invisible burden. It's possible to get so caught up in my obsession with my own story that I never think about what's going on in other people's stories. But the paradox is this. If I know and care about other people's stories, mysteriously, my own story will begin to heal and find meaning in much deeper ways than if all I do is just obsess about my own story. This is part of the secret to becoming the light of the world. Do you remember Jesus' very first sermon? He stands up and he looks at this crowd of of Greeks and Romans and Jews and ragamuffins and outliers and marginalized people, along with religious Pharisees and Sadducees. And he stands up and he says the most amazing thing. He looks at them and says, what? You are the light of the world. Let me tell you, that would not stand in any seminary today. They would say, wait a minute, whoa. No, there's been no crucifixion, there's been no atonement, there's been no resurrection, there's been no Pentecost, no church is born. You can't look at those people and say, you are the light of the world. But Jesus did, because he saw their divine potential. He saw what they were created for. And my friends, you are the light of the world. This is part of the secret to becoming the light of the world, that we begin to care, be concerned, and empathize with compassion regarding other people's stories. You know, in prison, I started this first ever in Canada. The warden asked he heard about Angola down south and how they started accredited college courses in theology. And he said, could we do that here in Canada? And so I said, well, let's try. So we partnered with a college that was close by, and we got it all set up, and we found this teacher, and the first teacher that we found, her name was Bobby, bless her soul. And this was her story. She said, I was of the mind, do the crime, do the time. Well, those are the consequences. You reap what you sow. Too bad for you, buddy. When are you going to pick yourself up and get serious about life? Until, guess what? My son was incarcerated. And it changed the way I saw everything. Everybody has a story. The secret to becoming the light of the world, of becoming the consolation that every heart is aching for, is to begin to look for, pay attention to, and care about other people's stories. So I want to say something that I anticipate will sound quite radical, but I really believe it's the heart of the good news. What is Emmanuel? What does it mean? God with us. Do you know what it says in Romans? It says that the ones who come to Christ, the ones that hear his love taking their side and come to Christ, he glorifies with his own presence. And here's this little phrase. I've never heard a sermon preached on it. It's a little lost, Romans 8:29. That he, Jesus, might be the firstborn among many. What does Jesus actually call us to? To become Emmanuel. And so this is my vision for us as a church. that Peace Church would be a place where we would come and actually experience the presence of God so that we can become the presence of God. That's actually God's vision for the church. And you know, the church, before it got hijacked by institutions and politics, the word church just comes from the Greek word ecclesia, which means the called out ones. Called out from what? Called out from the world's way of thinking, of taking care of me first. To become people of compassion and empathy, who see the plight of the burdens that people don't share, but knowing that we're all the same. And when we become those people of compassion, when we take the side of the marginalized, we actually, by God's grace, through God's presence, become Emmanuel. And if we don't get that, we don't get Christmas. And if we don't get that, we don't get what church is. And if we don't get that, we don't get God's vision for the church, for the world, for our families, for our neighbors, for one another. So as a new year begins, may God give us the grace to become Emmanuel, the consolation of God on earth, in our own homes, in our own neighborhoods, in our own community. Consolation is not an event. It's not a circumstance. Consolation is a person. And it's the person Christ is calling you to. May God, in his mercy, make this a reality in our hearts, in our homes, in our church, in our community. Amen.